Hello guys, so in this video we are going to talk about the direct pathway of the basal ganglia, and we are going to see the structures of the basal ganglia, and we'll look into the direct pathway. The first thing to remember is that two main neurons are involved in this pathway. One is the excitatory neurons, which are releasing the glutamate, and others are the inhibitory neurons, which are mainly releasing the GABA. So if I draw the structures here in this coronal section of the brain, we have our thalamus right here in the middle. This is the thalamus. Obviously a thalamus on the other side. Okay, so there's a thalamus and we have caudate nucleus right here. After the caudate nucleus, we got putamen. Let's show it here. So this is the putamen. On the medial aspect of the putamen, so on the medial aspect of the putamen, we have our globus pallidus externus and globus pallidus internus. So this will be globus pallidus externus, and this is the globus pallidus internus. Okay. Um, below the thalamus, we have a structure which is called the subthalamus. So this is a subthalamus, and even below that we have our substantia nigra, which is specifically in the midbrain, but I cannot show it in this diagram. But here is the substantia nigra below the subthalamus. Because substantia nigra is releasing the dopamine. And now let's talk about the connections of these basal nuclei with each other and how they are involved in the direct pathway. So we have our thalamus, we have our caudate nucleus, and the putamen, the globus pallidus externus, the globus pallidus internus, the subthalamic nuclei, and the substantia nigra. So usually the thalamus is connected to the motor cortex. So if I draw the motor cortex, it should be right here somewhere. And the thalamus is usually have excitatory connections with the motor cortex. So we can say that thalamus is excitating the motor cortex all the time. So all the time the thalamus is excitating the motor cortex, obviously through the glutaminergic neurons, but we don't want to move all the time. We don't want excessive movements all the time. We want controlled movements. That's why the globus internus is keeping the thalamus in inhibition. So the globus internus is releasing inhibitory neurons, mainly the GABA neurons, to the thalamus. So it is keeping the thalamus in check and controlling the thalamus in resting state. It is inhibiting the thalamus so that the thalamus cannot overshoot and overdrive the motor system to do the excessive movement. So this is in a normal position. In a normal resting state, the globus internus is inhibiting the thalamus so that the movements cannot take place, the abnormal or excessive movements cannot take place. But what if we think to have a movement? What if we want to do a movement? So in order to do a movement, we need to release the thalamus from the inhibition so that it can excite the motor cortex, and then we can do our movements through the muscular contractions and that stuff. So in order to do that, let's say you thought about having a movement. Now this whole connections of neurons come into play to release the thalamus from inhibition. release the thalamus from inhibition, first of all, we have connections of motor cortex with the corpus striatum, which is mainly the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So we have excitatory connections of the motor cortex with corpus striatum, okay, which is collectively um, the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So these are the glutaminergic neurons, the excitatory neurons, which are coming from the motor cortex. Now, these neurons excites the corpus striatum, and which in turn have another effect. The corpus striatum is connected to globus pallidus internus. So, from the corpus striatum, some inhibitory neurons are coming out, and they are connected to the globus pallidus internus. So these inhibitory neurons are coming, and if they are inhibitory, obviously they will be releasing GABA. So these GABAergic neurons coming from the corpus striatum in turn inhibits the globus pallidus internus. When the globus pallidus internus is inhibited, so it cannot do its function. It cannot um, it cannot keep the thalamus inhibited, because if this globus pallidus internus is inhibited, it will not function, right? This pathway is not working right now. So when this globus pallidus internus is inhibited itself, it cannot keep the thalamus in check, and in turn the thalamus is now released from the inhibition. And when the thalamus is released from the inhibition, it turn excites the motor cortex, which relates into doing our movements. Another thing is also involved. You see, below the thalamus is subthalamus, and then we have the substantia nigra, and which mainly secretes the dopaminergic neurons, the dopamine. So what happens is that dopaminergic neurons, the dopamine neurons, come out from the substantia nigra, and all the way they are connected to these inhibitory neurons, which are coming out of the corpus striatum and moving to the globus pallidus internus. So these neurons have a specific receptor, the D1 receptor for the dopamine. When the dopamine is released in this pathway on these neurons, this dopamine in turn excites these neurons even more. So that means this pathway is exciting these neurons even more. So they are releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters even more in the globus pallidus. That means that the substantia nigra is providing an other additional pathway for inhibiting the globus pallidus internus. That means the globus pallidus internus is inhibited even more, and the thalamus is kept out of inhibition even more. So this pathway in turn excites the thalamus even more, and the motor activity goes goes even more upwards. Okay, now what is the role of this subthalamic nuclei or the subthalamus? This subthalamus sends excitatory neurons to the substantia nigra. They have a connection. So this subthalamic nuclei excites the substantia nigra, which in turn excites these neurons coming from the striatum to the globus pallidus internus, which again promotes the inhibition of the globus pallidus internus. And when this globus pallidus internus is inhibited, this will not keep in check the activity of the thalamus, and the thalamus is released from inhibition and is able to excite the motor cortex for the motor movement. Okay, but we have enough of the movement now. the substantia nigra needs to regulate itself, so it in turn sends inhibitory neurons, the GABA neurons, to the subthalamus. So the substantia nigra inhibits again the subthalamus and tells it to stop exciting me so that I can stop this pathway and keep this thing in check. So this is called the direct pathway, and obviously it is exciting the motor cortex from releasing the thalamus from inhibition. And obviously when the motor cortex is excited, it will result in movement of muscles and contraction of muscles and all that. So this is the direct pathway, and these are the connections of the direct pathway, and that's all about it. Thank you.